Okay, hello again. So this talk is beginning of home computer revolution in Yugoslavia by Zarko Zivanov.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to apologize first for my maybe strange accent because I am very allergic to ambrosia and now is the season, so if I talk a bit through my nose, please forgive me. As Nicholas said, my talk would be about beginnings of home computing in Yugoslavia. Before I begin with that, I'd like to say something about myself and why am I doing that thing that I do. I'm very passionate about the old computers, specifically 18, 16, 32-bit computers from 80s and 90s, but I'm not very fond of PC machines. So if anyone wants to donate me something, please don't be a PC. Whole thing with old computers started somewhere in 2011 when some of my friends and I made a society called Once Upon a Byte. Our first big event was in 2012 and it was an exhibition for the Night of Museums in Novi Sad. We were placed at a department called Archaeology, which was very suitable actually. And that night we had more than 6,000 visitors. Okay, maybe not because of the old computers, maybe more because we were in a museum of Novi Sad, who usually gets lots of visitors, but we like to say that we had a lot of visitors that night. The main goals of our society is preservation of the old computers, old software, and literature for them. In that regard, we collect those machines, fix them, and make exhibitions. Those pictures are from the Night of the Museums 2013. I didn't actually collect from this year at the moment. Those ones are from the Lugon's Bear Camp 1 and 2 and last year's Balkan. Also, you have a small exhibition down in the basement right now. For my professional background, I'm a long-time Linux user. I teach at the faculty of Novi Sad, several classes about computing. Okay, let's begin history lesson. I don't know how many of you know, but actually during the 50s and 60s, Yugoslavia was one of the 6 manufacturers of computers in Europe. Only six countries produced computers, and Yugoslavia was one of them. Unfortunately, when the 60s came, for some reason, Yugoslavia abandoned its computer research and mostly imported foreign ones, mostly Honeywell and DEC. The big thing that was very important for the home computing was the invention of microprocessor. First one was developed by Intel engineers in 1971, and it was called 4004. It was a 4-bit processor and only one of its kind at the time. The bad thing with that was that for several years, people actually didn't know what to do with that thing. So the first small computer, home computer, appeared in 1975. That's 4 years later. But when the first one came out, it was followed very quickly by another ones. In the next couple of years, from 1977 to 1984, a lot of foreign home computers appeared. You will probably see some of them that maybe you used, and if your favorite one isn't here, I'm sorry, it was simply too much of them at the time. So what was happening in Yugoslavia when whole world started doing home computing? Well, the thing is that at the time we had very draconian import law that said that you cannot import anything that is more expensive than 50 Deutschmarks. Of course, any computer that you could buy outside was several hundred Deutschmarks, so it was practically illegal to import computer into Yugoslavia. So,
That was passed in the 70s?
for the 70s, I don't know, but during the 70s, you practically didn't had home computers. I'm not sure about the laws during the 70s. I know that big companies had their foot in Yugoslavia, like Honeywell and DEC, and they sold those computers, but under what circumstances, I don't know.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so the first solution for someone from Yugoslavia to own a computer was smuggling. It was practically a game of fooling a customs officer that strange typewriter isn't anything expensive, it's just some keys that you use to write letters to your aunt. But the thing is that it worked at the beginning, but customs officers very quickly learned what those machines are, and they weren't actually letting them in. Of course, there was officers that you could give something, and he will just look the other way. But this sort of importing wasn't available on a global scale. So very few people actually had computers before 1984. The second solution was to buy a computer from one of the very few firms that had some import contract. But because of the draconian import charges, those computers bought legally here were often 2, 3 or more times expensive than the computers on the in the rest of the world. So with regular salaries, you practically couldn't afford something like that. And of course, the third solution that came to fruition in 1984 was to build your own computer. In October of 1983, in one of the science magazines at the time, called Galaxia, was placed an ad for a computer kit that you could build at your home. The main person who developed that computer was Voja Antonić. Actually, you can see him outside. He's here for giving the next lecture after mine. And he was developing a kind of a home computer during the whole summer of 1983. At the end of the summer, he came in contact with people from Galaxia, and they decided to try to sell it in a kit form. The reason that it was possible because all the components separately were cheaper than 50 Deutschmarks. So you could buy components that are cheaper, but you had to assemble it yourself. When they placed an ad, they expected something about 50 to 100 kits sold, and they were very surprised when they got about 1,000 orders. Galaxia was actually inspired by something you probably know more. It's called Sinclair ZX81. It was also a very simple machine with very few integrated chips, and it was very cheap in the UK. Why did Voja actually make this computer? Well, the first thing is that it was practically legally impossible to own one. And the second one is that because of that, practically in Yugoslavia, you didn't have developed any kind of computer culture that was practically common in the West. So the main goals for Galaxia were to be cheap and to be good for learning. Voya didn't work alone on that project. I mean, most of the project was his own, but Dejan Ristanovic helped with the development of the operating system, and Jovan Regašek helped with developing the hardware. So what made the Galaxia cheap and unique? The first thing is that main board is very simple. It contains very, very few chips. You have the processor, you have memory, and have some of the logical gates. That's basically it. As you can see, I didn't say anything about the video output, which is something that home computers should definitely have. Video output is made entirely by Z80 CPU. So you didn't have a chip for a video, it was all done in software. Because of that, running programs on Galaxia was relatively, or maybe more than relatively slow, because maybe 80 or maybe 90% of processor time was spent on generating graphics. Of course, you could turn off the graphic generation and gain more speed if you want to do some calculations. The characteristics of the computer were relatively modest. It had 6 kilobytes of RAM and 4 kilobytes of ROM. In that 4 kilobytes of ROM was everything that Galaxia can do. It was basic interpreter, it was software that generated video signals, it was a code for input-output, and it was a line editor. And all was crammed into only 4K. Second thing that made Galaxia affordable was a single-sided PCB board. Why is that important? Because if you have a single-sided PCB board, you can practically make one at home. If you buy a empty PCB board and have the right chemicals, you could easily build it at home. If Galaxia was developed with dual-side PCB, that will be very difficult to make. I mean, to make at home. The lines are relatively thick, so it was a relatively successful process to make it. Galaxia also, first version of Galaxia had only one RAM, but Voya predicted that it would be nice to expand that computer, and the places on the motherboard were left for additional RAMs, which were developed in the next month. One ROM, second ROM for Galaxia contained, for example, monitor program for writing assembler code. For Galaxia, there were several peripherals developed. One of them was joystick. You probably wouldn't recognize something like that for a joystick. It was also completely self-made. And actually, to connect the joystick to Galaxia, you had to make some small modifications on the motherboard. Similarly to Singler computers and many others, Galaxia used air and mic outputs to connect to a tape recorder so you could load or save programs. The interesting thing, one more interesting thing about Galaxia is that because it was sold in a kit form, it actually didn't have any kind of case. So you could see something like that, and also you could see something like this one. Actually, the bottom one was one of the few that were made by a company, and there was a company who made about 200 or 300 Galaxias for schools, and they are the only one that had some kind of a case. When Galaxia first time appeared, it was very big news at Yugoslavia at the time, because it was practically first computer that someone from a Yugoslavian home could buy. Most of the media at Yugoslavia at that time jumped the bandwagon, and Galaxia was very well promoted in newspapers, TV, and radio. One of the radio hosts, you could also see him outside, Zoran Modli, had a radio show that was called ventilator 202 or fan 202, and it was a show about technology. And he got in contact with the developers of Galaxia, and one of the things that they did is that they emitted Galaxia programs over the radio waves. So actually, a host would say at one time, okay, prepare your tape recorders. So you would put a cassette in a tape deck, press record, and record a game for Galaxia. So you could, or program, so you could run it later. More adventurous users connected signal directly to Galaxia and had practically through wireless download in 1984. A lot of hardware extensions were developed. Galaxia gained high-res graphics, sound capabilities, more memory, and so on. And those extensions were mostly developed by more advanced Galaxia users. About a year later, also Galaxia Plus was developed by two young men, Nenad Dunic and Milan Tadic. It was practically compilation of all hardware advancements, and it was a much more capable machine. It is actually not very known how many Galaxias were actually made. There are some speculation that about 8,000 kits were sold, but because you could build one completely from the off-the-shelf parts, there is speculation that there are about 10,000 Galaxias were in existence, maybe not all of them finished to the end, but sometimes around 10,000. You can see here in the picture some of the cases that users of Galaxia made for their machines. As I said, because there was no official case, there are practically as different cases as collectors. Every collector had his own idea how the computer could be packaged. Today, it is very difficult actually to find a piece of Galaxia. Why? The Galaxias that were made by a company, that were made for schools, they appear from time to time on auction sites, and you can buy it for certain amount of money. Okay, but the ones that were built by its constructors, they were usually very, very jealously kept by them. And those were the machines that they invested a lot of time, and they are very dear to them. And so far, I haven't heard about a case that any constructor ever sold its Galaxia. I may be wrong, but I haven't heard something like that. So, what could someone do if wants to play with a Galaxia and not to use an emulator? In 2011, Dragan Toroman and Dusan Grujic at Petnica Research Center developed something called MicroGalaxia. It is actually a Galaxia clone developed on a FPGA board. They actually made a replica of the Galaxia and extended its capabilities by adding color. Original Galaxia had only black and white graphics. The color was added in such a way that you could practically color all the Galaxia games and run it in color without changing any of the code. This version also had mass storage that emulated tape recorder, and that mass storage was big enough to hold everything ever developed for Galaxia. Another project was finished in 2012. It was a project of Thomas Scholz, and he developed CMOS Galaxia. It is practically Galaxia that you could build with parts today available. If you're interested, you can go to his site, get the schematics, and build one for yourself. Actually, Thomas Scholz also gave a talk at CCC in 2012 about his findings about Galaxia, called the Ultimate Galaxia Talk. You can find it on the internet. It is very, very interesting. Okay, that was the Galaxia, our first computer, and practically our most important one because it was made in much larger quantities than any others. So what are the other computers that were produced? We had a couple of them, and they didn't have the success the Galaxia had. The difficult thing with the other computers was that they were all mostly made for schools, and the thing is that when schools changed the equipment, all the equipment was usually destroyed. That led to a situation that even if one finds one of those old computers, you don't have any documentation for them. And it is very difficult to find anything. If anyone has any documentation about those computers, please contact me. Okay, let's see what we had. First one is called Lola 8. It was developed by a company called Ivo Lola Ribar. The development started somewhere in 1983, but for some reasons, I don't know which, that computer didn't came to the market until 1985 or 86. That company usually at fairs in Yugoslavia showed the prototypes of the computer, and because they only showed prototypes at the fairs, there was a joke at the time that Lola was developed from fair to fair. The actual model that came to the market was called Lola 8A. It looks like this, and actually it has a very clean motherboard. The downside was that it was very, very expensive, and practically it was only sold to some of the schools. None of the households actually had this computer, but I'm not exactly sure could you actually buy it for a household or not. The computer that came to the market was very different than the prototypes they showed earlier and practically incompatible with it. Okay, next one is called Galeb, Seagull. It was constructed by Miroslav Kocian, and he started development of Galeb, I think, in 1981. But because he had troubles with importing components, his prototype wasn't practically finished until 1983. He came to a company called PEL, and they started manufacturing this computer in 1984. But because those laws that prohibited import were still at large, they had to do something to be able to import processors and memory chips. The law at the time said that you had to have enough import, so you could enough export, so you could have a sort of import into the country. And the thing that PEL company did was to sell homemade baskets, something like this, to be able to buy processors and memory. Okay. The computer was made in only, I think, 250 pieces, and that was it. The reason for his very quick demise was the next computer developed by Miroslav. It's called Orao. That computer was made in about 2000 pieces, and it was a very common school computer in Croatia. Some people from the PEL company actually started developing something called Orao Plus, which had more memory, better graphics, etc., etc., but that project never came to the market, actually, and they made something called Orao 64 that was made in very few pieces, and actually you couldn't find it on the market. Practically the first one, Orao, was the home computer in Croatia. Similar to situation with Galaxia, In 2007, Josip Perushanec developed a replica of Oreo computer called Oreo 2007, and a year later he developed a 2008 version that had ID interface sound with SID chip. Maybe some of you know where the SID chip came from. Yeah, Commodore 64. And had a specialized chip for the graphics. Actually, you can find the schematics for this computer and you can build it on your own if you want. Another machine which development started somewhere in 1984 was called Pecom, and it was put to market by company AE from Niš. The computer was the life of this computer started as a PhD thesis of a guy from Niš, and he was contacted by the A company to place that computer on the market. The thing is that Pecom was actually made as a proof of concept. It was just an experimental computer, so he could say, yes, I can make one, but it wasn't ready for the market. A insisted that put it to produce it, and the net result was that ROM basic for it, its operating system was full of bugs that were actually never corrected. The last ROM version, I think it is 4, still had plenty of bugs. One of the famous one is related to trigonometric functions. If you, for example, type sin s sine from 10, for example, it will calculate very fast. If you try the same instruction with a bigger number, you could wait for a minute to finish. The reason is that because it was a proof of concept, they had only a loop to subtract pi from a number to get to something that you can calculate, but it was never optimized. Pecom had one unfortunate thing of anecdote at the time, is that a company wanted to call it first Yugoslav home computer, or in Serbian, prvi domaći kućni računar. The abbreviation of that word, of those words, were something like fartman or pardomir in Serbian, and for that reason someone came with the name Pecom. Another interesting machine, I guess maybe someone heard about it. It's called Hobby ZR84. It was developed by a small company near Novi Sad, and it was developed by a 16-year-old boy who, thanks to his father, got very good knowledge of the electronics. This computer was inspired by Tandy, Coco, and actually had its basic, but all the other parts, all the hardware were developed by that high school student. Computer was made only in maybe 200 or 300 pieces, and to this day I don't know anyone who owns it. So if someone knows someone who has this machine, I will be very glad to take photographs and, if possible, to take the dump of the EPROMs from it. Okay, I have more. Seriously, it is a very interesting machine, and I actually had an interview with one of the people who were involved in development, and even he didn't have his own piece that had at the time. Besides making your own computers in Yugoslavia, some companies decided that it is more cheaper to just rebrand some of the foreign ones. So, for example, a company Montex from Montenegro takes something called Coco 2 Tandy Cockatoo, they placed their label called Misedo 85 and sold it mostly to Yugoslav schools. Actually, this was my computer from the high school. One thing that was, for me, interesting and disappointing for that time is that when I came to the first year of the high school, we had a teacher that wanted to teach us basic programming at this machine. And the thing is that that teacher actually didn't know any basic. By the time I came to the first year, I was already familiar with the basic because my parents bought me Commodore 64 a few years earlier. At one time, that teacher asked us to do some basic program that worked with strings. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with BASIC, but in BASIC, if you want to declare a variable that is a type of string, you had to add a $sign. So $1 would be a string variable. The programs that that teacher had, its book of programs, were always had the A string as a string variable. My solution used something called C string, C dollar, sorry. And she gave me a very bad grade because that program cannot work, because string variable must be called $. And I had to run the program and for maybe a couple of minutes convince her that this actually could work. I don't know, did you have some experiences like that? Yeah? Okay, so I'm not the only one. Another computer that was practically made by rebranding foreign computer was made by Автотехна from Slovenia, and it was called Oric Nova 64. It is actually a rebranded Oric Atmos, but with one difference, that is that it had 64 instead of 48 kilobytes of RAM. The thing is that people who did modification to the Oric Atmos actually didn't do its job very well. And you can, if you have the manual for this computer, it says something like, if you see a garbage screen when you turn it on, just turn it off and turn it on again. Yeah, and it happens a lot with this computer. One other thing that was very popular in Yugoslavia and in the rest of the world was to make a computer, to make keyboards for the ZX Spectrum. At the pictures shown here, you can see several of those keyboards. They were called professional keyboards for ZX, and you can see one of those keyboards down at the exhibition. Some of the companies actually sold ZX Spectrums together with their those keyboards as completely new computers made in Yugoslavia. More machines that were made in Yugoslavia at the time were CPM clones and PC clones. Actually, there was a lot of CPM clones made in Yugoslavia before '84 and after, but those machines were mostly targeted at companies, and practically, if you didn't work at a company who bought them, you practically couldn't see them. And that is also the reason why there is very few of them left today. One of those computers was Team 011, and it was made for schools. And some schools had them. It was a very nice machine actually, but very few working pieces are in existence today. As for the PC compatible machines, several companies made them. One was from Novi Sad called Novokabel, and another one, interesting, was made by same company who made Pecom, One interesting thing about their PC is that it was practically PC crammed into a keyboard case. So you had something like more large version of Commodore 64 if you look at the case. And they actually made a machine with Hercules and CGA graphics, and they also made a TV output for both of them. So you could practically connect this PC to a TV at home and work as a home computer. Okay, so what happened to all those machines that were in existence in Yugoslavia at the time? Well, the thing is that most of the companies that produced those machines wanted to make their machine as an official school machine in Yugoslavia. There were a lot of fighting and arguing over that because there was a big market and big money in it. The unfortunate thing is that during those fightings, school waited to see what would the official computer will be. Since there was no solution to that problem, schools bought whatever they could. They bought domestic computers, they bought foreign computers, they bought all kinds of computers. As you probably know, all those computers were mutually incompatible, so you couldn't save program from one computer on a tape and load it on another. I mean, BASIC is BASIC everywhere, but not exactly the same. The solution to this problem came somewhere in 1988, 89, and so on, when schools simply decided that it is a better option to buy a PC. So unfortunately, we didn't have a situation that UK had, where they had official home computer that was actually used at official school computer that was actually used at schools and at home. I guess you know which one was that, BBCB. And later Acorn Himit. Okay, so what is with those computers today? For most of the machines, emulators were developed, except for the Lola 8A, because no one until the last year, I think, actually made a RAM dump of that computer. And a friend of mine started to work on the emulator for this machine. That guy is Milorad Milanovic, and he also earlier developed the emulator for PECO machines. A lot of individuals in Yugoslavia, I mean not only in Serbia, in other parts of former Yugoslavia, are working on preserving of these machines, and we are trying to make them remembered. That is a part of our computer history and something that actually shouldn't be forgotten. And through the work of these men, including myself, the story of those computers is still being written. Thank you. Okay, I'm very hot under these lights. I'll move over here, so if you have any questions, please ask.
So in Ljubljana, there is a kind of media lab hackerspace, Kiberkipa, and
Yes.
they have a small museum of all computers. Are you in contact with them? Do you know which computers they have?
No, I didn't know about that. Actually, I was in Slovenia about 2 weeks ago. My wife and I were at Blade Lake.
I can
and-
put you in touch with them. And then,
Yes, please,
yeah, they can
please.
show you what
I
they
know
have.
about a very big computer museum in Croatia called Pick and Poke, I think
Oh,
in
yeah, it's
Rijeka.
in Rijeka, yeah.
Yeah, but I never had the time to go there. It is in my plan,
Okay.
but I like that contact, please. Yes?
When you asked about strange teaching experience,
Yes?
in primary school we had Team 011s.
Yes?
And my teacher was persuading me that only, for instance, line of code 20 go to 10 is correct line. If I put 22 go to 10 or 30 go to 10 is incorrect.
Because I was very annoyed by the competence of my teacher, I wanted to make her more confused. And after a few classes, I started to write programs that could actually be written in a few lines of basic code, but looked something like that. 10 go to 100, 100 go to 20, 20 go to 170. On 117 does something, then go to all over the code. I had something 30 or 40 lines of code that actually did nothing except jump all over, but program worked. And she was very confused how. Yeah?
Was done when you need for a computer to wait for some time. Because it goes into loop
Yes.
for some time and then it goes out of it. And you can, if you want kind of delay, you can do it like that. How many go-to it has, actually.
I don't remember, actually.
I do.
I'm not sure.
I do, because I did the same thing.
Okay. That machine, Misedo, or Tandy, had a relay inside it for turning tape recorder on and off. And it had two commands that was motor on and motor off. And when you start one of those commands, the relay will click. So when I found out about those commands, I made a small program that would motor on, pause, motor off, pause, and I called the teacher, teacher, please come here, something is wrong, it's ticking. Yes?
So you said that when Galaxia was published, it was published as a special issue of already existing magazine.
God.
You don't have computers, not at least legally.
Yes.
Since we did have magazines about computers, but nobody could import.
Well, actually, at the time that Galaxia came out, the complete schematics of Galaxia, ROM, etc. were printed in the magazine, a special edition of magazine Galaxia, and it was practically first ever computer magazine in Yugoslavia.
This was the second edition of the magazine Galaxia. Almost after the first edition.
Yeah, they reprinted that.
Yeah, I have the original one.
Oh wow! If you brought it with yourself, you could maybe ask Voya for an autograph. I will ask him for autograph on Galaxia. Practically, Galaxia started the computer revolution in Yugoslavia, and the year it came, 1984, 3 computer magazines appeared, regular computer magazines appeared in Yugoslavia, and 2 of them I know they are still in existence, Svet Komputera and Računari, but I think Računari was actually made into PC Press, right? I think. And the third one was from Slovenia called Moj Mikro, but I'm not sure is it still running or not. I mean, Galaxia had a very big influence on home computing and generally computer knowledge in Yugoslavia at the time. Yes?
What's your username on Limundo?
Did you outbid me for something or? Zarko. ZZRKO. Okay, we'll talk about it later. Actually, I mean, a few of my friends that also buy retro computers on the auctions, we usually don't cancel each other out. So if someone starts something, then the rest of us back off and it's his thing. Okay.
I would like to add 2 bits to your presentation. One, custom. There was limit about 84 and up that you can import only computer that has 64 kilobytes of RAM.
Okay, didn't know that.
And let's say 84 or 85, I don't remember. My parents bought Commodore 128, and they had about 4 hours at the customer street port. They were big trouble. And second, like Team 11,
Yes.
there was Iskra Delta PC that was more common in Slovenian part of Croatia. That was also CPM computer and was widely used.
Well, actually, my Commodore 64 were illegally imported in Yugoslavia by some guy from my father's home village, Kumane. My father was, how you call it in English, wall decorator? Yeah. Painter? Not painter. Okay. Anyway, my father and I went to his home village. We painted the whole house for that guy, and in return he bought me Commodore 64 in Germany and get it to Yugoslavia. I don't know how. But it was one of the jobs with my father that I really enjoyed, because I knew what will happen next.
It was very common people to go to Italy
Yes.
and bought Spectrum, and they would just Spectrum put it on the shirt
Yes.
without power supply, etc. And then after they
Well, actually,
they would make power supply.
my colleague from the faculty, Lazar, told me a story about a guy who imported his static Spectrum in 2 passes through the customs. First time he opened the Spectrum, put out the motherboard, and put in some tools, like screwdrivers, etc. And when he came to the customs, they asked him, okay, what's that? It's my toolbox, see? It's tools inside. And he bought it inside, and later he came back for the motherboard and imported, I don't know how. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that I wasn't too boring. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that you get more appreciation for the old computers of the 80s. Thank you.